everyone. Welcome to President Lincoln's Cottage. My name is Erin Carlson Mask, and I'm the executive director here. This is our first, what we hope is our first, annual Lincoln Ideas Forum, exploring the intersection of... That's actually a good moment to ask everyone to turn off their cell phones if you would at this time, please. Thank you. As I was saying, this is our first annual Lincoln Ideas Forum, exploring the intersection of Lincoln's life and legacy with contemporary issues. We're thankful to have this program supported by the Interpretation and Education Fund of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is an endowed fund made possible by a challenge grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We also thank National Geographic for providing current issues, featuring a piece on Lincoln's funeral train by today's moderator, Adam Goodhart, for each of you to take with you today. I also want to thank Callie Hawkins, our Associate Director for Programs, who put today's event together. All of our programs are an all-hands-on-deck effort, but Callie really pulled this idea together after we'd been thinking for many years that we wanted to do something like this, and that this anniversary was, in fact, the most fitting time to do it. We call President Lincoln's Cottage a home for brave ideas, not only because of what Lincoln accomplished within these very walls, but because of the conversations that happen here every day. And today we look forward to hearing many new and courageous ideas from people we're honored to call our friends. From advising on exhibits and programs, to helping provide security when Prince Charles and Camilla visited us a few weeks ago, to bringing students on pilgrimages here many years in a row, to drawing a pie chart of the places that were meaningful to Lincoln during his life. Just a hint, the cottage was a very large piece of that pie chart. Each of the speakers today have played a role in elevating our work and sharing our passion, all of our passion, for making new connections and reaching new levels of understanding. In an essay about Lincoln's daily commute, poet Walt Whitman observed, "I see very plainly Lincoln's dark brown face with the deep cut lines, and the eyes always to him with a deep latent sadness in their expression." And he says that no artists, no photographers have been able to capture that indirect and that very sad expression that Lincoln had on his face. He said, "There is something else there." And 150 years later, I think that we can all agree that there is still something else there. Lincoln may have died long ago, but the spirit of his ideas live on. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Adam Goodhart, the Hodson Trust Griswold Director of the C.V. Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. An historian, journalist, and critic, Goodhart is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, 1861, The Civil War Awakening, published to widespread critical acclaim. And we were so delighted to have him speak in this very room several years ago on that book. He has contributed frequent essays and reviews to the New York Times, Smithsonian, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and of course, National Geographic. He's a graduate of Harvard University and a member of our scholarly advisors. Please join me in welcoming Adam Goodhart.
Well, thank you, Erin. Thank you to Callie. Thanks to all of you. And thank you to Abraham as well. I mean, wow, to be here in this room. It's exciting. It's a little bit scary. You feel like he's sort of hovering and ready to say, "Ahem, excuse me, you just got that a little bit wrong." But it's just a thrill. We were talking, the speakers at lunch, about how if there's a moment that you stop being excited and getting chills about something like being in this room, it's just time to turn in your membership card as a member of the historical profession. I mean, that's it. So here we are. So I'm going to introduce the speakers. We'll be hearing from each speaker for about 15 or 20 minutes. There are 4 speakers. But before we start, I just wanted to speak for 5 minutes or so about the theme of Lincoln and ideas. And I wanted to start out with a story, with an episode from Lincoln's life at the very beginning of his presidency. So in the spring of 1861, as the troops of the Union and the Confederacy were taking to the field for this bloody contest that would determine America's future, Abraham Lincoln shut himself off from almost all visitors, closed the door of his office, and sometimes also came up here and closed the door to this cottage, and he wrote. For almost 2 full months, he toiled through multiple revisions and re-revisions of a 6,000-word message to Congress to be delivered on July 4th, 1861. Now, Lincoln's behavior, as you might imagine, baffled and even horrified many observers, and even people who were close associates and admirers of Lincoln, because they wondered, why is this new and untested president facing the worst crisis that the Union has ever faced in its history? Why is he pouring his energy, his time, his attention into this mere intellectual exercise of writing a presidential statement when all around the nation was being torn apart, and when he should be working full-time to arm and equip these great armies that were taking the field? Now, even, believe it or not, some of America's leading writers and philosophers felt this way, and no less than Ralph Waldo Emerson, in a private letter, actually expressed his alarm and his astonishment at this decision by Lincoln to shut himself off and write. He says, well, why doesn't Lincoln do what most American politicians do and just dash off a quick speech and then get on with his real work? But in that Independence Day message to Congress, Lincoln was arming America and himself for the long fight ahead. In that document, he laid out the political principles and the moral imperatives, in short, the ideas that would carry him unwaveringly through the next 4 years. Ideas like that this was, in his words, fundamentally a people's contest. The idea that this war was a battle not just for the future of the Union, not just for the future of democracy in America, but for the very idea of democracy for the future history of the world. The idea that disunion, secession, and democracy were fundamentally incompatible with each other, and the idea that this war, even though it seemed kind of strange and out of left field to people in those early months of the Civil War, this was a war about, in Lincoln's words, lifting the weights from all shoulders, giving to all a free and unfettered start in the race of life. So, having begun his presidency sort of falteringly and uncertainly in his very first weeks and months in office, Lincoln would henceforth lead with the strength and firmness and certainty that were unexcelled in and probably also unmatched in American history. So for Lincoln, ideas were real. Ideas were things. Ideas were weapons. And indeed, when you look back at Lincoln's biography, his entire life had been an education in this, from his very earliest years, in which books and the ideas and the words in those books defeated the deprivation and poverty into which he was born. Through his years as a lawyer, and I know there are some lawyers here in the audience today, some very good lawyers, who will attest that that's certainly a profession that teaches that abstract concepts and words have real power, power to determine lives and power even to take lives. And as I was driving up the road to get here, I looked out across those rows of graves, and I thought every one of those men was killed for, and maybe even in a sense killed by, ideas. And certainly it's also, I think, an essential fact of Lincoln's biography that for his entire life, and this is something that I haven't seen highlighted very often, for Lincoln's entire life, he never lived more than about 50 miles from the border between the slave states and the free states, whether he was in Kentucky or Illinois or Indiana or here in Washington, D.C., where he lived on the slave border. on the slave side of the border. In many places as well, including Washington, that border, the Mason-Dixon line 50 miles from here, wasn't formed by a natural barrier or geographical feature, but it was rather a border between two ideas, two conceptions of freedom. But that was a border as real and as impassable as any river or any canyon or any wall. Yet Lincoln knew that just as that border had been constructed by words and ideas, he knew that it could be demolished with words and ideas as well. And in fact, of course, it was something that he achieved, the greatest achievement of his life. So as we approach in a few days' time the anniversary of Lincoln's death, I think it's most appropriate that we're commemorating and honoring Lincoln for his powerful and his imperishable ideas, especially that we've gathered here at this site, this cottage where so many of his greatest ideas were wrestled into life, and a place that through the inspiration of the people who lead it and take care of it today, a house that, as they often say, is furnished not with bric-a-brac and antiques, but with Lincoln's ideas. So we're going to hear from 4 people today who are going to share some of the ideas that Lincoln had and some ideas that were inspired by his life and inspired by his death. And I'm very pleased to introduce the first of them, Jason Silverman, to you now. And I should say as well that after we hear from the 4 speakers, we are going to open things up to a conversation with all of you where you'll have a chance to share your thoughts and reflections and ideas about Lincoln's ideas. So Jason Silverman is the Elliott Capers Palmer Jr. Professor of History at Winthrop University in South Carolina, where he has taught for 31 years. Prior to that, he taught at Yale for 4 years. He is the author or editor of 10 books, several of which were nominated for major awards. And he's author, especially of interest today, of the forthcoming Lincoln and the Immigrant, which will appear in September, published by Southern Illinois University Press. Of the 16,500 and counting volumes published on Abraham Lincoln, and if you want to do the math, I read the other day that according to the Library of Congress, there's a new book on Lincoln published every 5 days. Wow. Yeah. But of all of these 16,500 books, there has never been one, believe it or not, on Lincoln and immigration. So Lincoln Land is a place where there's still room to wander and graze. Jason Silverman is a former South Carolina Professor of the Year. He holds degrees from University of Kentucky, Colorado State, and the University of Virginia. And please join me in welcoming him.
Every time that I'm introduced somewhere and someone says nice things about me, I can't help but remember a story about Abraham Lincoln that I read in a county history when I was researching my book. And it might be apocryphal, but it just sounds so Lincoln-like. During his intense debates in 1858 with Stephen Douglas, Lincoln came back to his law office and was greeted by a number of his friends and neighbors who all wanted to tell him he had done a good job and that to keep up the good work. And he was standing there getting all of these compliments. And I think we all know that Lincoln was a pretty humble individual. But he turns to his law partner, William Herndon, and he says, "Billy, this sounds like a funeral oration. I do believe these people will be upset if I wake up tomorrow morning." I have every intention of waking up tomorrow morning, so thank you. My interest in Abraham Lincoln dates back to the 4th grade. In a vintage 1950s public school environment for teachers, parents' night, my 4th grade teacher decided that we would have silent vignettes of history And so some people would dress up in outfits that look like Amelia Earhart or Charles Lindbergh or Lewis and Clark or George Washington. One of the vignettes that she wanted was a vignette of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And so I volunteered to be Abraham Lincoln. And my fourth grade teacher said, "You can't be Abraham Lincoln, you're not tall enough. You have to be Stephen Douglas." So dating back to that day in the mid-1950s, I swore by all that was sacred. I might not be tall enough to be Abraham Lincoln, but by God, I could study him my whole career and write about him, and that's precisely what I've done. Now, Adam wasn't exaggerating, and he wasn't speaking in hyperbole when he said that in all of the books, nothing has ever been written about Abraham Lincoln and the immigrant. And I've always been interested in Abraham Lincoln, and about 5-6 years ago, I was teaching what we have in my department called the capstone class. The capstone class is basically a course that every graduating senior history major has to take, and they have to write a paper. And the paper is the capstone of their career. Well, obviously, this semester that I taught it, I was going to teach about Abraham Lincoln. So several of the students came to me and said, "Well, Dr. Silverman, what can I write about?" And I thought, all right, fine, fair enough. I'll find some topics so that everybody doesn't write on the Emancipation Proclamation. Everybody doesn't write about the Gettysburg Address. Everybody doesn't write about the assassination. So I came through all this list, and I found in my looking that nothing had ever been written before about Abraham Lincoln and the immigrant. And I thought, no, can't be true, can't be true. The more I looked, the less I found. And finally, I did something for the first, last, and only time in my entire academic career. I sent out a query on a listserv. And I said, "This is what I'm thinking of doing," because I thought, if it's never been done before, I want to do it. I'm not going to assign it to students as a paper. And I sent out this query, and it comes back, all of these people, respected and respectable Lincoln scholars, saying, "My God, it's never been done before. It really hasn't. Do it. Go ahead and do it." So I did it. And it wasn't particularly easy, but it was very, very rewarding. Because what I'm going to share with you today is sort of a nutshell of what I have found and how relevant it is in today's world in regard to Abraham Lincoln and the immigrant. And most of this stuff was pretty new to me when I started out, and I hope it's kind of new to you too. During the wearying winter of opposition in 1964, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was asked rhetorically, how long would it take for a Voting Rights Act to pass? How long, King replied? Not long at all, because the arc of the normal moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It was an aphorism that King had borrowed before from the 19th century abolitionist preacher Theodore Parker, and it can be used to measure the unlikely man who became the 16th president of the United States. In many ways, Lincoln is the nation's most captivating president, not only because of his impossible rise from obscurity to power, but because more than any other, he personified the evolutionary, indeed the revolutionary arc of bending towards justice. In this way, Lincoln represented the personal embodiment of our larger national quest for a union defined by an even greater, even firmer commitment to freedom and equality. And although Lincoln's arc was cut short prematurely, he nevertheless broadened this arc to include a group that had been traditionally omitted, immigrants coming to the United States, seeking a better life and future. This is a story worth telling, partly because it's not been told, let alone told well enough and effectively enough before, but also because it marks a watershed moment in the history of American immigration. The country's 16th president, unlike so many Americans of his era, did not have an anti-immigrant bone in his body. Every ethnic and religious group he believed were neither good nor bad on the basis of affiliation and birth. They were human beings and American citizens, entitled to the same respect, rights, and privileges guaranteed to every American by the Constitution and by natural law. Ethnic and religious pluralism was, according to President Lincoln, an asset to American democracy, not a liability. Lincoln, it could be said then, was the first melting pot president. As a politician, he courted ethnic group voters. For Lincoln, all immigrants were potentially good Americans. In particular, he supported the right of immigrants to become citizens through naturalization, and having done so, to vote in federal elections. Lincoln held these positions consistently from his entrance onto the American political stage in the early 1840s through the Civil War and until the time of his death. The Republic of Free Labor that Lincoln championed depended on the continued expansion of the Northern economy, which could not be achieved without a steady supply of labor from Europe. By settling in the unorganized territories of the West, immigrants could help ensure that the United States as a whole would be more free than slave. Underlying these ideological, if still quite practical, concerns was a less tangible belief that the quality of American democracy depended in part on how it treated its immigrants. Lincoln's first statement on immigration came in 1844. In May of that year, clashes between Irish and nativist mobs culminated in the burning of 2 Catholic churches, a seminary, and numerous Irish homes in Philadelphia. Local and national Democrats rallied to the Irish cause and accused the Whigs, Lincoln's party, of inciting the violence. Lincoln helped organize a public meeting in Springfield where he delivered a speech and offered a series of resolutions rejecting the contention that the Whigs were hostile to immigrants or were responsible for the Philadelphia riots. The resolutions that Lincoln wrote affirmed the Whigs' commitment to the principles of naturalization laid down in the 1790s. They also stated that the rights of conscience guaranteed by the Constitution applied to Catholics as well as Protestants, and that the Whigs would oppose any interference with these rights. That the Democrats were wrong about Lincoln's views on adopted citizens was abundantly clear in Massachusetts 15 years later in 1859, when voters there approved an amendment to the state constitution establishing a 2-year waiting period before naturalized citizens could exercise the ballot. The Know Nothing Party, an anti-immigrant party, had achieved their greatest political strength in Massachusetts, where a virulently anti-Irish movement won the governorship and a huge majority in both houses in the 1850s. Many local Republicans supported the amendment, but Lincoln strenuously opposed it, both on principle and on fear that it would identify his party with nativism. I have some little notoriety for commiserating the oppressed condition of the Negro, Lincoln explained in a letter printed in the Illinois State Journal and other newspapers, and I should be strangely inconsistent if I could favor any project calling for the curtailing of the existing rights of white men, even though born in different lands and speaking different languages from myself. He concluded by articulating a vision of social mobility and great appeal to all immigrants, then and now. That some should be rich shows that others may become rich, and hence is just encouragement to industry and enterprise, Lincoln said. Let not him who is houseless pull down the house of another, but let him build one for himself, thus by example assuring that his own shall be safe from violence when built. In his annual message to Congress in December of 1863, the president addressed three aspects of immigration. I submit to your consideration the expediency of establishing a system for the encouragement of immigration, Lincoln wrote. Although this source of national wealth and strength is again flowing with greater freedom than for several years before the insurrection occurred, there still is a great deficiency of laborers in every field of industry, especially in agriculture and in our mines, as well of iron and coal as of the precious metals. While the demand for labor is thus increased here, tens of thousands of persons destitute of remunerative occupation are thronging our foreign consulates and offering to emigrate to the United States if essential but very cheap assistance could be afforded them. It is very easy to see that under the sharp discipline of civil war, the nation is beginning a new life. This noble effort demands the aid and ought to receive the attention and support of the government. The first aspect he asked Congress was about conscription, a subject of particular interest to the Irish, and I might add the Irish weren't even supporters of Abraham Lincoln. They were Democrats, and they didn't like the anti-slavery attitude of the Republicans, formerly the Whigs. Many foreign-born Americans, Lincoln warned, were evading military service by denying that they had declared their intention to become citizens, or by denying that they were already naturalized. To remedy these abuses, Lincoln asked the Secretary of the Interior to be furnished with naturalization records, declarations of intent, and voting records. But Lincoln also called for a greater legal protection through special courts, if necessary, for immigrants who were being tricked into military service by labor contractors. And he called on Congress to draft new legislation to encourage immigration in an effort to meet the ongoing shortage of labor in industry, mining, and agriculture. The result was the Act to Encourage Immigration passed in July 1864, the first significant piece of federal legislation in the area of naturalization since the laws of the 1790s. And I might add that in the sesquicentennial year of celebrating absolutely everything, Lincoln and the country's signature piece of legislation went virtually unnoticed in the papers, in the editorials, everywhere. A new law, Lincoln wanted, designed to attract immigration via labor contracts rather than to regulate their arrival or restrict their entry. This new law clarified that immigrants could not be drafted unless they announced their intention to become American citizens, and that they were not required to become American citizens in order to stay in the United States. In his last annual message to Congress in December of 1864, Lincoln urged that the amendment law be amended to help government officers prevent ongoing frauds against immigrants, and he once again emphasized that the United States neither needed nor intended to conscript immigrants upon arrival. Though he did not mention the Irish in particular, it is obvious he had them in mind, so he was even thinking about his political adversaries. In April of 1864, Lincoln chose the occasion of a public speech in Baltimore to define the difference between two meanings of the word that he believed was so central to America's understanding of itself, the word liberty. The world has never had a good definition of the word liberty, Lincoln declared in this state that still had slavery but was about to abolish it. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Here are two not only different but incompatible things called by the same name, liberty. As he often did, Lincoln went on to illustrate this point with a parable. One of the first books he has read as a child was Aesop's Fable, and throughout his life, Lincoln apparently told simple stories about animals to make subtle and profound points about important matters. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, Lincoln said, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as a destroyer of liberty, especially as the sheep is a black one or foreign one. Plainly, the sheep and the wolf were not agreed upon a definition of the word liberty, and precisely the same difference prevails today, Lincoln said, among us human creatures, even in the North, and all professing to love liberty. Hence, we behold the processes by which daily thousands are passing from under the yoke of bondage, hailed by some as the advance of liberty, and bewailed by others as the destruction of liberty. A few years ago, the Huntington Library in California sponsored an essay contest on Lincoln for high school students in connection with a major Lincoln exhibit. One of the finalists was a 17-year-old girl from Texas, whose forebears had immigrated to the United States from India. She wrote, and I quote, that if the United States wasn't in existence today, I would not have the opportunity to excel in life and education. The Union was preserved not only for the people yesterday, but also for the lives of today, unquote. Lincoln surely would have applauded that statement. In 1861, he said that the struggle for the Union involved not only the fate of these United States, but also the whole family of man. It was a struggle, not altogether for today, but for a vast future also. We are living in that vast future. Lincoln's words resonate in the 21st century with as much relevance as they did 70 years ago. Now, I would have ended there. That's where I was planning on ending until I picked up the New York Times this morning and saw an op-ed piece this morning by Timothy Egan. And the title of it was Remains from Lincoln's Last Day. Now, in full disclosure, I should just tell you right now that I have no use for Democrats or Republicans today. I don't like any of them. I really don't. I have problems with them. But this is a quote from today's op-ed piece. Could the Republicans in Congress in 2015, the party of no, ever pass a Homestead Act? That law, which went into effect the very day, January 1, 1863, Lincoln's wartime executive order to free slaves in the breakaway states did, carries a clause that very few Republicans would support now. Former slaves, famine Irish, Russian Jews, Germans, single women, Mexicans who didn't speak a word of English, all qualified to claim 160 acres as their own. You didn't have to be a citizen to get your quarter-mile square. You just had to intend to become a citizen. In that sense, the Homestead Act was the dream act of today. It had a path to citizenship and prosperity for those in this country who were neither citizens nor prosperous, unquote. That is today. And if Lincoln would have been very pleased with the words that young lady wrote in her essay contest for the Huntington Library, I don't think Abraham Lincoln would have been very pleased at all to read those words today from the party that he helped found. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for those fascinating remarks. And our next speaker is Bradley Miles, who currently serves as Polaris's Chief Executive Officer, in which role he's been working on combating the issue of human trafficking for the past 12 years. Bradley played an instrumental role in the creation and launch of Polaris's operation of the U.S. National Human Trafficking Resource Center, hotline. And last year, the NHTRC hotline learned about and responded to over 5,000 human trafficking cases. So for those of you who thought that the abolitionist movement ended in 1865, it certainly did not. Brad is currently focusing his efforts on Polaris's future strategy for the next decade, which includes working towards better anti-trafficking hotline coverage to increase identification rates for all 21 million victims of human trafficking worldwide. Put that in perspective with the 4 million people who were held in bondage in America in 1865. And new data-driven strategic intervention efforts targeted toward eliminating specific types of modern slavery in the U.S. and around the world. He holds degrees in psychology and political science from Stanford University. Please welcome Bradley Miles.
Well, it is an incredible honor to be here in this space and to speak to you all today. And thank you, Dr. Silverman. That was an incredible talk, and also so relevant for today when we talk about the modern slavery still of immigrants being tricked by labor contractors, the same purpose that Lincoln wrote that law. So what I'd like to try to speak to you all about today for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so is to address this central question, which is, if Lincoln were alive today and someone informed him that there was modern slavery still happening in the United States around the world, how would he react? How would he feel about it? What would he think? What emotions would go through his mind? And to find out that the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War and all the things that he fought for, especially that he thought were taking hold right as he was assassinated, to find out that 150 years later that slavery was alive and well in America and around the world, how would he react? And I think that he would have a few different reactions. One, I think he'd be curious about, well, what is it and how's it still happening and what does the problem look like? And I think that he'd want to know what was being done about it and who was going to finish the job that he thought was finished. So what I'd like to speak to you all about today is to try to talk about the problem of modern slavery and what it does look like, and then talk about what is being done about it and toss some ideas out there about what more could be done about it. So starting with the problem. You heard Adam share the statistic. The International Labor Organization estimates that there's about 21 million people around the world held in forms of slavery, modern slavery, forced labor each year. And there are some studies, academic studies and other studies, that put the number as high as 35 million. And when you estimate the profits that are made off those 21 million people held in slavery, the International Labor Organization estimates that human trafficking is a $150 billion global criminal industry, one of the fastest global criminal industries in the world. And here in the United States, we're not immune to the issue either. I think in the United States, lots of people would like to say, well, I can understand it happening in Cambodia or the Ukraine or somewhere far away, but surely not here in the United States. And in the United States, we know that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are still held in situations that would be defined as modern slavery. At Polaris, we're a direct service provider. We've served 700 survivors of trafficking. And on the hotline that we operate for the country called the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, we've learned about over 17,000 survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery just through that hotline. And we know that that's just the tip of the iceberg. So hundreds of thousands of folks here in the United States still held in these situations. So there's a federal law that was passed. It was passed in the year 2000. It's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was a modern day attempt to pass another law to address forms of modern slavery. It was passed unanimously through Congress, and it defined the new federal law of what's called trafficking in persons. And it describes three different buckets. One bucket is children who are being exploited and held in the sex trade against their will. Another bucket is adults who are age 18 or over, held in the sex trade through some sort of force or fraud or coercion, violence, lies, threats, deception. And then the third bucket it describes is all the forms of labor trafficking and forced labor, where people are being forced to work as domestic nannies in agriculture, in mining, in construction, in restaurants, all the different places where people can be forced to work, again, through that form of force or fraud or coercion. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act defined these three buckets of how the conception of the law would be going forward. And interestingly enough, they were looking for a place to put those laws. Where in the US canon of criminal law should we put these new laws that we just defined on modern slavery? So they flipped through all the laws and they found this chapter, which is Title 18, Part 1, Chapter 77. And it was this old chapter where all the laws that were passed from the 13th Amendment and others were codified to make committing slavery a criminal act. And if you read some of those old laws, it says, transportation aboard of slave vessel. And all these other things, you're like, well, how would that actually apply today? And those laws went through 1581 to 1588. And so in the year 2000, they decided to pick up that count again. And the new laws that were passed in the year 2000 were 1589, 1590, 1591. So the laws that are worked on modern-day slavery today that are still being prosecuted across the country are 1589 and 1591 are the two main ones, where in that chapter, history and the modern day are blended together. So you have this federal law that happened. And the federal law also, by clarifying the definition, helped to highlight some of the myths that are out there that people think about the issue of modern slavery. I think one of the biggest myths that people think is that somehow it only happens far away and that it doesn't happen here in the United States. Another myth that people think is maybe it only happens in the sex trade. That's what they hear about in the media. That's what they read about. They see the movie Taken. It's a woman forced into a brothel. They don't realize that actually forced labor and people being forced to work against their will is actually the largest form of modern slavery in the world, with 68% of the victims around the world being forced to work in some sort of labor or service sector. Another myth out there is that when you hear the word trafficking, you think movement. You think, oh, well, this is kind of like smuggling. It's kind of like migration. Where was she moved from here to there? And actually, the law very clearly said this is not a crime about movement. This is a crime about exploitation. This is a modern-day form of slavery. So you have hundreds of thousands of folks here in the United States, 21 million people around the world, $150 billion criminal industry happening to men and women, adults and children, immigrants as well as US citizens, people coming here documented on different types of visas, guest worker visas, H-2A, H-2B, the summer visa to come here for summer work, the J-1, the diplomat visa to bring your nanny over with you if you're a diplomat working for the World Bank, the A3 or the G5. You see people actually committing modern slavery with legitimate visas, not just people who are undocumented. And one of the reasons that we know that the crime is growing so fast is because traffickers perceive that society is kind of ill-equipped to respond to the modern-day issue. People either don't believe it's happening, or the nonprofit sector hasn't been resourced to effectively fight it, or law enforcement hasn't been resourced to effectively fight it. And so the current status quo is that traffickers are going undeterred and victims are still stuck in a cycle of abuse. So around the world, less than only 2% of the victims of modern slavery are found and identified every year. The other 98% are still stuck in those situations. Around the world, there's only about 6,000 convictions for the crime of human trafficking globally, when we know that that's about less than 1% of the total people committing the crime. So the other 99% say, it's open season, high profit, low risk. I can make lots of money by selling people in the sex trade or by forcing people to work, and the chances of me getting caught and actually punished are actually quite low. So that's why this is one of the fastest growing crimes, is because of that high profit, low risk. Who's being victimized? I think we could all guess, especially from what some of Lincoln's statements were with some of those bills. Those who are the most vulnerable: immigrants, people who grew up with a cycle of abuse, people who are runaway and homeless youth, people who are fleeing war and fleeing political unrest, maybe the people fleeing Syria and Yemen right now and what's going to happen to that vulnerability. And that traffickers are actually the folks that sense that vulnerability, and instead of wanting to help and build a safety net, they actually want to prey on that vulnerability and see it as a money-making opportunity. So it's the vulnerable folks that are most likely to be trafficked. People in the child welfare system, people in foster care, people who are running away from abuse in the home, people who are running away from sexual abuse. There's a pimp waiting on the other side saying, I'm going to capitalize on that. So that's who this is happening to around the world. And one of the things that strikes me working on this modern day issue is the more I learn about history, the more I realize that the modern issue is not so different from history. And the industries where slavery has happened all around the world for thousands of years are the same industries where it's happening now: agriculture, construction, mining, fishing, domestic work, parts of the sex trade. And the tools in the toolbox of the people committing slavery, the tools in the toolbox of the perpetrators: beating, lies, threats, taking someone far from home, giving them a new name, pitting people against each other, manipulation, the company store debt. All those old tools in the toolbox are still very much alive and well today that traffickers are still using. And I think the biggest difference between history and now is that now, no longer anywhere in the world is it legal to own another person as property. Every country around the world, including Mauritania and others, have abolished those laws. And now it's not the systemic targeting of a certain race and a certain people the way that it happened historically. But now it's much more heterogeneous, but it's very much, I think, as prevalent and as alive today as it was all throughout different parts of history. And I think one of the things that might be so troubling to Lincoln is to find out that when you mentioned the arc of justice, it actually is the same arc of slavery that has existed through every single day in American history since the country was founded. It never stopped. It didn't stop in 1865. It didn't stop with the Emancipation Proclamation. If you read about the convict leasing that happened in the 1880s, if you read about what happened to some Irish immigrants and others with white slavery and others in the brothels in the early 1900s in New York City and other places, if you read about what was happening to Asian immigrants and the, quote, yellow slave trade, and you visit some of those tunnels that are under San Francisco's Chinatown where young girls were held in brothels in the early 1900s, if you read about the Mexican immigrants coming here to work in farm work and the bracero system and things where there was slavery also happening, you begin to put the thread together and you say, let's apply this modern day definition of kids held in the sex trade by pimps, adults held in the sex trade through force, fraud, or coercion, and anyone forced to work through force, fraud, or coercion. And let's take those lenses and apply them to the 1970s and 1950s and 1930s and 1890s, 1670s, 1720s, and you realize it's the same exact arc. And that's what I think is so disturbing, is I think Lincoln would realize the job was never finished. So what's being done about it? I think there is some hope here. I think Lincoln would be happy to know that there are federal laws being passed, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the bills that are being heard before Congress, even as we speak. There's been about 13 bills that have been introduced in the Congress addressing all different forms of trafficking. I think Lincoln would love to know that there's political will on this issue from President Obama to the cabinet, to governors and attorneys general and others all across the country, even extending all the way to the Pope, who's been making this issue a major priority since he became Pope. So there is political will. I think Lincoln would love to know that there's actually a network of nonprofits that have grown up, that are founded exclusively to work on this issue. Because when you learn about some of Lincoln's philanthropic activities, which I learned from Aaron and Callie and others, that he was giving philanthropically to organizations that are working with people who are held in slavery. And he would love to know that there is an outcropping of nonprofits working on this issue. Polaris is an organization that was founded about 13 years ago, named after the North Star, to give a nod to history as a symbol of freedom for people who are escaping the Underground Railroad, looking to that North Star and recognizing it's the same star that we're looking at every night, and that symbol of freedom can still be there. So that's where I work, but there's hundreds of other organizations working on identification, therapy, going out with the police to find victims, shelter, counseling, job training programs, awareness programs. There's a whole modern day movement working on this issue. Law enforcement's getting better equipped to work on the issue. There's human trafficking task forces across the country. There's human trafficking specialized units in police departments. The DC Police has a human trafficking unit now that used to be the Vice unit, but now they're beginning to realize that most of what that Vice unit was doing was actually finding pimp-controlled women and girls in the sex trade, and they were misidentifying them as trafficking victims, thinking that they were simply prostitutes, and not realizing what was happening behind the scenes, that they were being controlled by pimps. So now that unit's the human trafficking unit. Survivors are speaking out, just like survivors in the historical movement led the movement in many ways. There are survivor organizations and survivor-led organizations and survivors speaking out and saying, this happened to me, and now I want to be a champion for this issue. So there's a survivor-led element to the movement that's happening, which is incredibly exciting. There's awareness campaigns. You saw the movie 12 Years a Slave that won the Best Picture, and then Steve McQueen, the director, and Brad Pitt and others who worked on that film actually said, let's use that film to generate a conversation about modern slavery, not only about the slavery that happened that was depicted in the film. So there's films, there's books, there's media articles, there's student groups. And President Lincoln's Cottage here is working with students opposing slavery, mobilizing high school students across the country and around the world. So there's a growing momentum to the movement. There's hotlines. Polaris operates the national hotline for the United States, where we have staff at our offices 24/7, sitting there awake, receiving calls from people all across the country. Because what I think Lincoln wouldn't have anticipated maybe is that you don't have to only rely on horseback and the Underground Railroad and a star to find your way at night. People have cell phones in their pockets now. And we could do something with those cell phones, because people who are held in slavery actually have phones. And they can shoot a message via text, and they can make a phone call. But the tragic thing is most of them don't know the number to call. And so how can we get that number out there more and say, if you're being held in slavery by a pimp, shoot us a text message at BeFree, 233-733. And there are people who are actually stuck in these situations where we'll get a text from inside a hotel room that's like, my pimp just beat me, but he fell asleep. And while he's sleeping, I'm shooting you this text, but I don't want him to wake up, so I don't want to make a phone call, but I'm shooting you a text, and can you send the police? Can you send someone here so I could get out of this hotel room before my pimp wakes up? And that was actually a text that we received just a few weeks ago. So people are making those messages. That is the kind of modern day element of the Underground Railroad now, using global telecommunications technologies. So there are things like that. But even historians are making the linkage. There's the Historians Against Slavery effort that Jim Stewart and others are working on. So I think that Lincoln would be heartened and excited to hear about the movement. But I think that he would also be impatient to know that our movement is not having the impact that it needs to have. If we're only identifying 2% of the survivors every year, if we're only having 6,000 prosecutions around the world every year, I think he'd realize there is so much work to be done to finish this unfinished job of actually living in a world where there is no slavery. So some ideas. Just like Lincoln was combating unscrupulous labor contractors that were tricking immigrants to come to the United States and defrauding them, just like Dr. Silverman talked about, that is one of the main forms of modern slavery still existing in the United States today. It's those middle labor brokers that are going to poor towns around the world and promising jobs and promising, I could get you into America and I could hook you up with a visa and I could hook you up with a job. And once you get to America, I've got it all worked out for you. All you got to do is pay me an upfront fee. And if you can't afford the fee, you can go into debt, and I'll give you some debt that you can do, but get to there and then I'll hook you up with a job. That's happening in the shipyard building industry. That's happening with workers on golf courses. That's happening with workers who are hotel housekeepers. That's happening with so many different places where it's the labor recruiter that's engaging in trafficking. So what are we doing to regulate that industry of those labor recruiters, and how are we tightening up some of the regulations on that industry, just like Lincoln was trying to do back in his time. So that's still happening as one of the dominant forms of slavery around the world and in the United States, are those labor brokers. Another idea, if we're going to be using this text message line, how do we get that line out around the country? We've only received about 2,000 texts so far and helped about 200 people get out of slavery as a result of a text. But that means that only a sliver of the American population even knows that that text number exists. How do we get that concept of 233-733, be free, out there across the country? Another idea, State Department came up with this great idea that said, well, if anyone's coming to the United States to work on a visa, we have a moment of intervention there because they're sitting there for the visa interview. So in that moment of intervention, we're going to tell them about their rights. And we're going to tell them about what work needs to look like when you come to America. And we're going to have a Know Your Rights session in your visa interview. We're going to give you a pamphlet. And if you can't read the pamphlet, we're going to read it to you in your language. And so all these people coming to the United States now on all these different types of visas are given this Know Your Rights pamphlet. And on the Know Your Rights pamphlet, it says, if you get here and it's a bum deal and it's not what you expected, call this number. And it's the National Human Trafficking Resource Center that rings at Polaris. So we've received thousands of calls from folks saying, so glad I learned about your hotline, because when I got to America, this is what was in store for me. And so how do we work with countries around the world to ensure that that know your rights concept doesn't just exist in America, but exists in every country around the world, anywhere where there's visas? If I'm traveling to somewhere and I need to get a visa to get to that country, someone should sit down with me and say, if you get there, here's what's going on when you get there. Here's your rights, and here's a hotline number to call. I think we can extend that know your rights concept to 100 different countries. So we could be getting text messaging out there. We could be getting this know your rights idea out there. We can be regulating labor recruiters in a different way. There actually is not a global hotline on human trafficking. We've tried to map out hotlines around the world. We found about 70 countries that have them. The rest of the countries don't. We found about 100 hotlines around the world, but there are certain countries where if you're stuck in slavery, unfortunately, there isn't really a number that you can call. Canada, for example, no national hotline. Costa Rica, no hotline. So why is it that someone who happens to get victimized in Taiwan knows the number to call, but someone who's victimized in this other country, there's just not a number for them to call? So how do we work towards more hotlines around the world? How do we work towards even a global hotline where there can be one number that people memorize all around the world? The other thing that I'd say too is there is slavery in the supply chains of certain companies. And it's a conversation that people don't want to talk about because it's much easier to keep the issue at arm's length when you say, well, it's that pimp doing it to that girl in foster care, but that's not like me, right? But when you begin to say, well, maybe slavery was in that little sparkly eyeshadow that you put on your eyes because it was mined in certain parts of India, or maybe slavery was in that rug that you bought for your house. Maybe slavery was in this white undershirt that I'm wearing because that cotton came from a certain place that was picked with slavery. Maybe that cheap shrimp that I bought to cook fried shrimp at my house and I bought at a certain store, that shrimp was actually picked by slaves who were held in awful situations on slave boats off the Thailand shores and the New Zealand shores. And you realize that there's actually slavery riddled in so many of the products that we all use every day. Palm oil, one of the products that have made it in so many different products. They call it kind of this miracle product, the miracle commodity of palm oil, is being picked and harvested in horrible conditions in different parts of Indonesia and other places. And palm oil makes it into so many products that are in our day-to-day. So all of us, whether or not we know it or not, may be consuming, contributing to different things where slavery was part of it. And just like in the past when people said, I won't take sugar in my tea, if this sugar was picked by slaves, how do we build some sort of modern day consumer movement where people get much more thoughtful about every single purchase they make? They say, can you guarantee that this thing I'm about to buy didn't come from any slavery? How do we create that consciousness amongst all of us? So there's so much still to do, and there's so much progress to be made, and it's an enormous, enormous issue that's being combated in the modern day. And I think the folks that are working on it are drawing inspiration from history, learning about what was done in the historical fight, realizing that it's the same arc, and that we're really continuing that fight, and how do we actually continue that fight today? And I think probably one of the things that Lincoln would probably be the happiest about is to know that we were all standing here in this bedroom when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation here, that President Lincoln's cottage has kept those ideas alive and is still stimulating these conversations about how those ideas apply to the modern day and the modern fight against slavery, and that we're all here today to have this conversation. So thank you so much. Let's have a good afternoon.
I see that the ideas are already buzzing and bubbling around the room, which is great. And do save those thoughts for our conversation at the end, which, by the way, it's not going to be a Q&A with the speakers. It's really going to be a chance for you to share ideas that have been inspired by these speakers. And our next one I know is going to spark a lot of thoughts. His name is Brian Dixon, and he is a special agent with the Department of State's Bureau of Diplomatic Security. He was hired by Diplomatic Security last year in 2014 after having served in the Secret Service Uniform Division since 2006. The Secret Service, of course, coming directly out of the Lincoln era, as he will tell us. During his career in the Secret Service, he worked as an access control officer securing the White House complex from unwanted individuals and intruders. He worked as a patrol officer around the White House with postings throughout the building and neighboring buildings. And he also worked at 3 United Nations General Assemblies in New York and provided security for 2 presidential campaigns and inaugurations. So he, perhaps more than any of our other speakers today, has been really front and center in experiencing history. As part of his training at the Secret Service, Brian Dixon received the Physical Fitness Award and the Firearms Qualification Award for basic officer class, Firearms Qualification Award during Special Operations Training. A lifelong student of the martial arts, he has a 2nd-degree black belt in Taekwondo and has trained in various types of kickboxing and jiu-jitsu, so I really hope I haven't offended him with anything I've said in my introduction, but please welcome Brian Dixon.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's been a very interesting road to actually get here. And I want to thank Callie for keeping up with me. It was just a few short weeks ago that I was actually here helping out with security with the Royals detail that I met Callie and Aaron, and they professed to me that we had reached out to the Secret Service to try to have somebody come out and speak. Unfortunately, no one was available, and I said, well, I have worked with the Secret Service for so many years. I'd love to help you, get in touch with somebody or find a good phone number. And they said, well, why don't you just come out and speak with us? And I said, I will ask the powers that be, and I need to iterate that I'm not here in any official capacity for the Secret Service or the State Department, seeing as how I'm going to use it as a catalyst for thought. So what I'm hoping to do today is share some history and how it relates to security today, especially presidential security. And the overall theme will be, is this really necessary? I think all of us will just say yes. Presidential security is necessary. But what I hope to provide today is more of an insight from the inside looking out. I know for the visitor to the Washington area, when they see a 20-car motorcade barreling down the road, it's very much a delight. But to the average worker in D.C., it's much to their chagrin that they see the MPDC cars roll by with lights and sirens, and the intersections are stopped for 10, 15, sometimes 20 minutes. And all of us know that 20 minutes in D.C. could mean the difference between making the pivotal meeting at your corporate office or being disqualified from that and possibly losing your job. So I'm going to start with that basic question. Is presidential security necessary? And if so, how much is enough? And so going over the basic security for President Lincoln, it didn't exist much back then. As history will tell us, it was a difficult idea, difficult concept to say, what, there are forces out there, forces of evil, whatever you might want to call them, that want to do us harm. So for President Lincoln, he preferred to go horseback riding by himself. He didn't want security, he didn't want people around him, and there's such a case where there was an assassination attempt that actually a person shot his hat instead of him, although Lincoln denies that. The hat was found with the musket hole in it. So yes, never underestimate somebody with a musket rifle. He also used security by the Pinkerton agents. Now the Pinkerton agents, Alan Pinkerton, today you would call him probably Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater. It was almost like a privatized militia. The Pinkertons were used as agents to use coercion for protection. They were helped to provide security, and they helped provide security for Lincoln during the Civil War. Unfortunately, they were not there on the night that he was assassinated. Nor was the MPD officer that was stationed outside of his door. During the final act, it is said that Lincoln allowed that MPDC officer to leave, and he was released and was next door at the tavern with the coachman having drinks. The officer was later questioned about it and had said, "I'm very sorry." Lincoln said that I was released from having to guard his suite, and therefore there was nobody at his door. And John Wilkes Booth, of course, came in, and we all know the rest, what happened. Also interesting, because you would never think today that Tom Cruise would go to a movie and assassinate the president. Nor do they think that back then would a famous actor such as John Wilkes Booth actually enter into a booth and shoot the president, dive onto the stage, and then make a valiant getaway, or try to. Now, from that, if you could possibly imagine 20 or so horse-drawn carriages with a couple hundred different people carrying muskets, that would be almost the equivalent of what would have to have been necessary for Lincoln in today's terms. Nowadays, we have large motorcades, we have all sorts of police forces, everything dedicated to this idea of security. Now, for people that have gone on to the campaign, have ever gone to any sort of campaign rally, you'll line up at the line, you go through a magnetometer by UD officers, and the retired veteran from the Second World War will walk up and you'll say, "I'm very sorry, sir. I appreciate what you've done for your country, but your small little pocket knife you've been carrying since you survived the war will not be allowed in." And the look you get is, why? Why not? You know, what is there about me? What is the threat that says, hey, you can take this away? I mean, I was a war veteran. Also, whenever someone says, hey, this hotel is closed, or you get a phone call saying, hey, the Secret Service is asking you to close your window to your hotel room. Why does that happen? Why is that necessary? You know, what's the catalyst behind that? So I'm going to go over a very brief history of the Secret Service. And it's interesting to note that the night or the day that Lincoln was assassinated, the legislation to pass or to make the Secret Service a federal agency was put onto his desk. And so it could very well have been Lincoln that signed the Secret Service into life. Unfortunately, it was not. It happened that next July. In 1865, the Secret Service was created as a department of the Treasury to help suppress counterfeiting. Back then, counterfeiting was a very big deal as it is today, and there was no department or no agency that actually focused specifically on counterfeit. And so the Secret Service was created. Now, it wasn't until 1901 that the Secret Service actually took over presidential security. So people often ask, well, you know, you've had 4 presidents assassinated on the Secret Service watch. It actually hasn't been that. It's only been 1, unfortunately. Now, on October 1st in 1922, as a request of Warren G. Harding, the White House Police was created. The White House Police was there to basically, as the name implies, protect the White House. So you had the Secret Service that was doing counterfeiting, and then the White House Police that was protecting the White House. Now in 1930, they merged and the White House Police became a part of the Secret Service. And after that, in 1970, it became the Executive Protective Service, and in 1977 became the Secret Service Uniform Division. And to this very day, there's only ever been 1 Secret Service officer killed in the line of duty. That was Leslie Coldfeld at the Blair House. And I'll go over what happened during that attempt in just a little bit. Now, next question that people always asked me when I was in the White House is, why are you so invasive? Why do you care so much about what I'm carrying in my pockets? What's in my water bottle? What's in my purse? What's in my backpack? Why do you want to know why I have 4 jars of baby food instead of 3 jars of baby food as I push 1 single child into an event instead of 3 children into an event? And this brief explanation, I can't go through all the assassination attempts, but hopefully this will help shed some light on that. Of course, on April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth. And I already said the legislation was already on Lincoln's desk to create the Secret Service. Now, James Garfield, on July 2nd, 1881, he was shot twice by Charles Guiteau and later died of his injuries. Now, Guiteau was supposedly insane, which brings up a very interesting thought. What makes somebody insane? Because at that time, who else would try to assassinate the president but somebody who was insane? Of course, now we know, and now we have thousands of books gone over what makes a person insane, what makes a person a criminal, what makes a person a religious fanatic. And so it's a very, very tricky discussion, tricky, very fine lines. But he was found to be mentally unstable after shooting the president. Nowadays, you might say, well, what were his motives? Back then, people didn't necessarily think about motives. They thought about the psychology of it. Well, he was just a crazy person. Who else would do that? William McKinley, on September 6, 1901, was shot twice by Leon Czolgosz, who concealed the gun in a bandage, which might answer some of the questions. Why do you care about what we bring to these events? Why do you care about walking through a magnetometer into little the magnetometer goes off and it beeps, why are you so invasive? Why do you have to sit there and wand me? It's just my belt buckle. Why do you have to feel above my stomach to see if there's actually something behind the belt buckle too? Because it has been the instance where people have been assassinated, just in this case, by somebody who had a gun concealed in a bandage. Leon Czolgosz was a self-proclaimed anarchist, and no longer the crazy person, but somebody who had actual political affiliations. Although not really sure what he would have gained by this assassination, he still claimed, I have a reason, I'm not insane, this is what it is, this is what the reason is that I am doing this. So this was one of the first times when someone said, hey, maybe people aren't just insane, maybe they're not just crazy. Maybe we should look further into why do these things happen instead of just giving a blanket statement, well, you must be insane to want to kill somebody like this. And it was after that event in 1901 that Secret Service took over security. They're asked by Congress, will you please do this? And officially the year later, the Secret Service took over security for the president. And for John F. Kennedy, we all know, 22nd November 1963 in Dallas, Texas, he was shot by what the media is now calling a long gun. And it's become the new hot word recently with all the different events going on in the world right now. He was riding in an uncovered limousine, and it was very exposed, and even though he was traveling, was still shot multiple times by Lee Harvey Oswald. That took a very different turn for presidential security because now we have to take into consideration how much exposure can our protectees have? Can we let them sit there and ride in a limousine that's uncovered? Does it have to be inside of an armored vehicle at all times? Can the public even see them? And if the public or somebody is in a window, do you make that person move away from the window? Do you have to have somebody watching that person at all times? So now we have to take consideration, okay, well, there's not just people in a crowd, not just weapons disguised as bandages. Now we have actual former military personnel who are well trained with these weapons that can actually make these types of shots even on a moving target. Revolutionized how we thought about security and the precautions that we now have to take, and unfortunately, it's society at large that suffers because now instead of taking an hour to get into a campaign event, it takes 3. And now it's why, Grandpa's pocket knife is being taken away from him. And during the inaugurations especially, whenever the president decides to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, do we let him? He is a person of the people. This is a democracy. He is a public official. He needs to be seen and heard. And I don't think Abraham Lincoln would be the type to have hidden in his carriage and said, I'm not going out there. I think he would have wanted to be seen. He wanted to be out there and be able to speak to people because how much interaction you have with people determines how much they like you, but how much you get across to them as well. And hiding is just not the way to do business, especially in the government. Those are all of the actual assassinations of presidents. I'm going to go through some of the attempts and to further kind of explain why we do some of the stuff that we do. I love this example because Andrew Jackson seems to be a man of my own heart. And while on the steps of the Congress in 1835, Richard Lawrence pulled out a revolver and decided he was going to shoot Andrew Jackson, and the gun misfired. He pulled out a second revolver, or a second musket, and decided, I'm going to shoot him again, and that misfired. He was subdued by Andrew Jackson, who beat him severely with his own cane. And was later arrested. Of course, he was also said that he was going to be mentally insane. He was a painter by trade, and they said, well, why would a painter want to kill the president? He must be insane. Of course, now we know that we can't just call people insane. Another great example, I love this one too, of Teddy Roosevelt on October 14th in 1912 was shot by John Schrank, who was also later found insane. Now, the bullet hit a 50-page speech that Roosevelt had. The speech was folded over once, and it also hit a metal glasses case that he had in his pocket. And the bullet still lodged in his ribs. Once Roosevelt realized he was not in mortal danger, he still gave his speech. And I believe he said it's going to take more than a revolver to put down a bull moose or something to that effect. Another man after my own heart. It was also the one that said whenever Schrank was dragged down, don't hurt him. Leave him unharmed. And he was arrested and taken away. The bullet actually remained in his ribs until the day that he died. They could not remove it. It's quite tenacity for a president. Franklin Roosevelt, on February 15th, 1933, this one is still up in the air as to if Roosevelt was the actual target, but he was shot at 5 times by Giuseppe Zangara, but all the shots missed. The mayor at the time actually died. They thought that he might have been the target since he was opposed to the Al Capone gang. But that's still a debate and still not really sure exactly what happened there. Harry S. Truman, on November 1st, 1950, was attacked at the Blair House by 2 Puerto Rican activists. Leslie Colfelt, again, White House police officer, died in the attack, but he was also able to kill one of the attackers, and the other attacker was also wounded. And Truman was in danger, but was never harmed. And they were doing renovations of the White House at that time, and he was staying there at the Blair House whenever they decided to act. And every year, they still have a wreath laying for Officer Colfelt on Pennsylvania Avenue. Gerald Ford, on September 5th, in 1975, there was an attempted shooting by Lynette Fromm, who was a follower of Charles Manson. To those that know how a gun operates, she was carrying a Colt 45 1911 pistol, and it had 4 rounds in the magazine, but one had never been chambered into the weapons. The weapon didn't have a bullet in the chamber, as they say. She still tried to shoot it from the crowd, but all they heard was a click, and she was subdued immediately by the Secret Service agent standing right there. So that also is the question, why do you guys walk through crowds? Why do you sit there and, want to get my hands out of my pockets? Why are you so adamant? Why do you shake my elbow about it and say, hey, get your hands out of your pockets? What's that? Why do you walk through a kitchen and say, chef, put your knife down real quick. We got someone coming out, put your hands on the counter. Why do you do those kinds of things? And these are some of the examples of why we have to be that invasive in people's lives whenever security is conducted. On September 22nd, just a couple weeks later, Gerald Ford was shot at by Sarah Jane Moore with a revolver, but the shot missed because she was grabbed by a bystander and brought down. Again, another lone gunman in the crowd. And this has been kind of the overall theme up until this point, or actually up until Ronald Reagan's point, I'll go over in a second, of this idea of the lone wolf, the lone gunman. What is the lone gunman? What are their motivations? How do they differ from the anarchist or the person that has political affiliations that wants to see an actual gain, either financially or religiously or ideologically? How do those two differ? And that's something that I really can't answer today because no one really knows. What's the difference between a lone gunman because his ideas any less important than the political assassin? In their minds, probably not, because they're still trying to assassinate somebody. Ronald Reagan on March 30th, 1981, was shot by John Hinckley Jr. at the Washington Hilton. Those tourists like to go to the Hinckley Hilton. They'll notice they actually built a brand new area where the presidents are now taken for ingress and egress during that time. He was struck once, ricochet off the door. The Secret Service, as you can see in the video, was very quick to grab him, throw him into the car, and speed off. Again, if you notice the changes in how security is done, it used to be, well, maybe we'll have a security guard, by the president or by the protectee, whoever it is. Now it's 4 or 5. We've grown from 1 or 2 to now 4 or 5 bodyguards. Excuse me, they call us bullet sponges. That's great. Which has been an idea, and I'll bring up more about that, how that's changing here in the future, how we're not mere just bullet sponges anymore, how we're not just bullet traps, how we're not going to dive in front of people to save their lives, but how it's actually changing in people's minds and in our minds, how we react to different threats. George H.W. Bush, on April 13th in 1993, 14 individuals supposedly working for Saddam Hussein smuggled explosives into Kuwait in order to assassinate him. Now it's no longer the lone gunman, the lone wolf. Now it's actual people getting explosives, which probably don't cost a dime or two. They're probably kind of expensive, so they have to have money, a place to get it. They have to have a place they can smuggle it into. They have resources. So now it's no longer, it's just somebody in the crowd that's going to take a gun and stick it out. Now it's actual threats of, explosions. Bill Clinton on October 29th, 1994, some people have seen this video, the Duran shooting. Francisco Martin Duran fired, I think, 28 or 29 rounds from a rifle he had hidden in a jacket at the White House. He was subdued by 3 bystanders. Now, outside the White House, you see uniformed division patrol officers walking up and down like I used to have to do. Now you look and you see the guys in black I used to wear on the grounds walking around with machine guns. Is it necessary? Do you have to have that? I can't say yes or no, but these are some of the things that prompt us to do what we do and make your lives, kind of a living hell when you come to our campaigns. George W. Bush on May 10th in 2005 in Tbilisi, Vladimir Artyunian threw a grenade onto the podium during one of his speeches. The grenade was so tightly wrapped in the handkerchief, it didn't go off. That's the only thing that saved his life. Indira Gandhi on October 31st was killed by her own bodyguards. And so now our vetting program to actually hire new agents isn't just a 1 or 2 month program. You don't just apply online and all of a sudden you get it. Background checks, polygraphs, 14 months, 16 months is not uncommon when it's hiring, for a security officer. Martin Luther King was shot on the hotel balcony. Why do we have to sit there and close balconies down, close hotels down? Why can't, our protectees go out and get a breath of fresh air sometimes? Nobizada Lincoln Ali Khan, one of the founding fathers of modern Pakistan, was shot twice in the chest during a public speaking event, and the motives to this day are still unknown and were poorly investigated. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia was shot by his half-brother's son, his own nephew. When ceremonially they'd walk up to each other and give each other a kiss on the cheek, as they were doing that, his nephew shot him in the head. So now even family members, we can't be trusted. And I know I'm running out of time. I'm very sorry about that. Rafiq Hariri, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, was killed by the equivalent of 1,800 kilograms of TNT that was placed along a motorcade route. So now what do we have to do about driving in cars? And that will bring me down to the final thoughts that we're doing. What is this idea of security? We've seen how it can work. We've seen how it can't work. We've seen how even with bodyguards, even with the most advanced technologies, even with the beast they use that we've all seen, hopefully you've seen on the Discovery Channel with the exposés on the Secret Service. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. How safe can you possibly be? And what is the role now of security? It's no longer the bodyguard, no longer the bullet trap or the bullet sponge. Now it's becoming more of a security advisor. How can our public officials stay public but be safe? How can our public say, I've been treated fairly while still going to these events and to the campaigns and don't feel cheated or don't have pocket knives stolen? And how can we prevent attacks and avoid attacks using intelligence gathering, doing pre-planning, operational planning? And so it's becoming more of a cat and mouse game rather than we'll just stand here and we'll just deflect whatever happens. Now it's a thinking man's game. It's no longer privatized armies with men in military suits and machine guns. Now it's analysm, it's desk work, it's actually getting into the minds of people and avoiding things before they even happen. So I'll use that as a cast for thought today. Is it necessary? What would Lincoln have done? What would we have given him if we had known what was going to happen? And that's where I'll end it, and I thank you so much.
We'll move expeditiously onto our final speaker, who asked me to mention especially that, several of our speakers today, he is not a scholar or a historian, but a doer and practitioner in the present. Lucky guy. He is a practicing registered architect since 1975, and he is the principal architect at Schinberg Levinas. Previously, Milton Schinberg worked with the nationally noted firm of Arthur Cotton Moore and Associates, and his projects, renderings, and articles have appeared in local and national publications. He's known as a leader in the design of schools here in the nation's capital, and he's designed school buildings and converted school buildings across the metro area. In addition, he's designed numerous commercial and residential projects and worked with nonprofits for over 20 years. He's made many presentations before the United States Commission of Fine Arts and other boards and received awards from the American Institute of Architects. He has also taught as an adjunct at Catholic University School of Architecture for 37 years teaching a wide range of courses, including one of the best course titles I think I've ever heard, called Beauty and Brains, which is about the cognitive basis of architectural perception. In other words, the architecture that happens within our minds, which will be some of his subject today. And he's made presentations on this subject to the National Academy of Science and Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. He's a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University, where in fact he has done some important work as an architect. So please welcome Milton Shinberg.
It is very strange that I, a boy brought up in the woods and seeing as it were but little of the world, should be drifted into the very apex of this great event. Lincoln's remarks to Josiah Blackburn in July of 1864. I'm here to weave together my own fascination with Lincoln and my particular orientation as an architect. I try to teach young architects that the minds and spirits of our clients, which help form their destinies, should be our deepest focus, not only their functional needs. And so we'll talk about the affective or emotional qualities of architectural experience. This is about the intersection of this place with the Lincolns and with the other residents of the old soldiers' home. Its texture and feel are not complete without all of them. Architects like to talk about space, but we really prefer to talk about place, a broader and deeper quality beyond style that resonates in all styles. Space is dimension and proportion. Place adds presence and meaning. The right frame of reference for this talk isn't house, it's home. The connotation is totally different. A house is a thing. A home is a setting for a family and all that a family is and does. Books about Lincoln attempt to capture him one way or another, of course, and we turn the last page hoping finally to find him, but he's just out of reach. He's a mirage. You get closer, he disappears. I read about Lincoln as a very young student and tried to imitate his signature. And as a troubled teenager, which of course is redundant, I'd slip out of my house while everybody was asleep. Some siblings are here who didn't know about that. I'd drive down to the Lincoln Memorial, park in front, and slowly ascend to his temple. He was thinking, or so it seemed. I would think along with him. What better company than the 16th president? We both looked out over the reflecting pool to the Washington Monument and to the Capitol. The White House, his home, isn't visible from there. I would look into that sad, wise face, the eyes tired, but still glowing with some vision of what could be. So majestic and so human, towering, but not remote. It's not just about who is Lincoln, but when. From 1776, the birth of our revolution, to that Gettysburg Address is, of course, 77. But that doesn't get us forward or make it personal. So for me, from Gettysburg to my birthday is 75. My father's birth in 1905 was almost exactly halfway between the two. Not really so long ago in the big picture. From me to Lincoln's death is only 3 generations. I realized that to find the essence, just subtract time. Then space and presence remain. Lincoln begins to emerge from the mist. If you want great challenges, time and Lincoln are good ones. And perhaps this house is the best place to start because in some discernible way, our ghost president is all around you. This place, this cottage, this setting, this moment, and the time of day all speak to us of present and past merged. He was right here on a day exactly like this day, 150 years ago. He never really leaves the soldier's home or the White House or Gettysburg or Springfield or a meager log cabin. He is in all simultaneously. Every moment glows like the flash of this moment. We imagine his hand on the cooler wood handrail right out there. We see him coming down the stairs early in the morning and going up late in the evening, exhausted once again. We feel the floorboards giving ever so reluctantly, microscopically to his steps. His feet, wrapped in the carpet slippers described by writers and visitors, pass slowly across the floors, whether he's alone or with visitors that often come unannounced, late at night, even after Lincoln has gone to bed. He greets them with monumental patience. George Riggs, a prominent Washington banker, Riggs Bank, for some of you who know, remember that, purchased this land for a weekend house 2 miles north of Boundary Avenue, now called Florida Avenue, which is the bottom edge of the steep escarpment that brings us to from the Bowl of Washington to the Riggs property. We're atop one of Washington's highest hills right here. The Riggs property is further away, therefore, vertically as well as horizontally, from the unhealthy summertime conditions near the Potomac. The reverse view back to the city is sanitized and made more glorious than the city is up close. It hints at what it might be, a vibrant republic in white stone. The house shares something with the prairie houses of Frank Lloyd Wright, actually. His ideas for those houses sprang from the same frontier sensibilities that helped shape Lincoln. They face the distant view, the broad horizontal windows of this house aligned with the horizon, as were the prairie houses. The underlying principle is called refuge and prospect and applies to home, and it also applies to war. It guided and protected our earliest ancestors, at least the ones who survived to be our ancestors, and it's beneath the surface of us all. Fish don't know they're in water. First, prospect. You can see off in the distance what is heading your way, friend or foe, predator or prey, bluecoats or gray. Lincoln's poem of 1846. When first my father settled here, 'twas then the frontier line. The panther's scream filled the night with fear, and bears preyed on the swine. This was no abstraction to Lincoln. And refuge. You're protected, not out in the open. The higher ground is better both for defense and attack. So one big example, a cave above the ground plane, hard to reach. Think Native Americans and their cliff dwellings of the American Southwest. A more familiar one, the front porch. There's one here. We think of that as a place for resting, for talking, for letting the world go by, but it would feel very different at the sidewalk level. It's the elevation, the setback, the proximity to the safe place inside the house that makes it work. These instincts and the emotions that reflect them are buried very deep in us all. Architecture, whether in new dress or in old dress, including this house, beauty totally aside, can give us some of what we need emotionally by mirroring the life-preserving tactics of our ancestors. In 1842, Riggs engaged William Deggs, who derived the design from then very fashionable contemporary publication of cottage residences by Andrew Jackson Dowling, the chief proponent of the residential Gothic revival style. Downing's thrust was connection to and resonance with nature to achieve beauty and calm self-reflection, a chief quality here. Think Thoreau with conveniences. The house is a middle style in terms of decoration, not heavy with detail, but the detail does matter. It has a quietness and orderliness of space and movement, economical in layout, efficient. It's an American home. It is plain spoken without being humble or apologetic, and in its way, it is an avant-garde progenitor of many homes. Walk around the house if you haven't so far. It's not a simple box. It's broken into smaller boxes that give it a smaller, friendlier scale, and a rhythm that does not march but varies in gentle, careful modulations. Downing did not favor monumental, overwhelming mansions that detach themselves from their surroundings. This is no McMansion. It has a well-developed integration of vertical and horizontal elements, speaking as an architect, but the resolution of them is horizontal, relating to the broad ground plane, like the prairie houses. Its vitality as a design comes from the vertical counterpoint of its gables, pointing to the clouds by day and disappearing into the night sky. In Lincoln's time, multiple furniture ensembles would have coexisted in the space almost exactly like this space downstairs for a mostly polite conversation. Imagine Lincoln reading to Tad or Mary or friends standing by that fireplace right there. The house is more open on the south side, facing the bright summer sun. Light penetrates deeply, then reflects off the large walls to brighten everything. The sun is part of the house, and it is a greenhouse, in fact. Elizabeth Smith Brownstein's In Lincoln's Other White House, which I encourage you to buy across the road here, cites the New York Evening Post that they found Lincoln living in a handsome but not pretentious double-story house with parlors on both sides, neatly but not ostentatiously furnished. That sounds like this house, but it's actually Lincoln's Springfield house. That could have been part of the attraction to this place, in spite of the soldier's home, real purpose and real function. Riggs sold the land to the government in 1851 and moved back to the city, which is ironic. They returned in part to get away from the place where their daughter became ill and died, here in this house. The Lincolns came from the city, from the White House, after the loss of their son, Willie. The creation of the Soldiers' Home was spearheaded by General Winfield Scott after the Mexican-American War and by Robert Anderson, Lincoln's superior in the Black Hawk War. Later, Major Anderson, who commanded and then surrendered Fort Sumter on the orders of his former subordinate. Congress objected to its creation, but a senator swayed him. His name was Jefferson Davis. Washington City was considered not just unhealthy, but for those of means virtually uninhabitable in the stifling, hot, humid summers. The others had no choice but to stay. The waters of the Potomac sometimes made its citizens sick, and some died. Mary Todd Lincoln and many others believed the typhoid fever, which killed their 11-old son, Willie, the child who was most like Lincoln, that it came from those unsanitary conditions. He died there, in the White House, not here. The Soldiers' Home had a different source of fresh water. It was not the White House in so many ways. I began this talk, or my thinking about this talk, with the thought that it was a refuge. It's an obvious thought, but like many thoughts about Lincoln, it was obvious, the obvious was not correct, it was wrong. So consider for a moment what the house is not. It's not a cottage. This is not a log cabin grown large. It's a mansion. Next, it is not an escape. It is not even a pause. The war, if anything, was more present here, not less, with the wounded next door and the dead nearby. Lincoln had no choice but to observe, during his regular walks and rides here, those who had given their last full measure of devotion. That was no abstraction either. A telegraph installed here brought him the same news as the telegraph that was in the city. There was no escape. Then it is not ultimately a refuge. The phrase that eventually came to my mind was "at a remove," a place separated by distance. It's a very different environment here, a platform with the potential for building or rebuilding the self, not isolation. And last, it is not the White House. Lincoln's crisis. Lincoln sees the unfinished Washington Monument from here, the reminder of an unfinished republic. Does he imagine meeting Washington, the first in his line of very human presidents, and telling him that the republic that he brought together, held together with such sacrifice, has now come apart in the 16th, 80 years later, that it did not endure? Imagine that for a moment, that other possibility. Would he see the White House of the Confederacy directly across the Potomac, occupied by President Lee? Would, after the war that neither side could win because he had not found his Grant, had not found his Sherman, when both sides agreed to end hostilities and to go their separate ways after 2 additional years of horror and another 100,000 casualties, would his countrymen need papers to cross the Potomac to visit their former countrymen, relations and friends? Would burning hatred and embitterment be the enduring condition, poisoning every future generation? Both sides had run out of men. Freed slaves could not cross the river at all without risking permanent captivity. He carried that torment, a pounding force in his mind that he could not possibly escape, regardless of the house he was in, or the porch that held his rocking chair, or in the woods he traversed. He was focused on his mission, keeping the Union together and keeping his own soul together while he did. What could this place give Abraham Lincoln, man, president, husband, father, commander-in-chief, that the White House did not? My thought is that being here at a remove gave him the margin to endure and to bind up his wounds. Imagine that this place was his Sabbath, rendered throughout the week, not 1 day out of 7. That day of rest can be a day of engagement in the life of the Spirit, nurturing and restoring the soul. Lincoln would know that the Bible doesn't say that God took the 7th day off. It says, and on the 7th day God finished his work which he had made. Lincoln didn't get the day off either, not any day. But I think he did get some Sabbath, the Sabbath that is built into this place, the house and its setting. He must have thirsted for that taste all the time, and when here he found the cool spring when he needed it most. This was the place to imagine a more perfect union. The Sabbath would be a window, a meditation on what could emerge that was good and right, and an end to slavery, an end to this bitter war, a future time of reconciliation and reconstruction. Here he could follow his better angels. And perhaps his ride away from the White House, the epicenter of his challenge, was a portable Sabbath, a great healing act, bringing him to his wife and son in a softer, more verdant setting here. Lincoln had 3 seasons here, and each gave him something. The coming of spring isn't new, but it is renewal. Autumn isn't new, but it shows us that there is beauty even in death. Summer in between is our vitality, our strength, and the most intense time of war. The days were longer when he lived here. Sunrise was earlier, sunset later. Winter was his time at the White House and also the time of sad remembrance. I charted the months, the seasons of his years, and some of his losses. Lincoln's mother died in October 1818. He suffered a major depression, so severe his friends were concerned about suicide and took his knives away from him in 1836. He broke off his engagement to Mary Todd in January 1841 and had another depressive incident that's been well recorded. Lincoln's father died in January of 1851. Eddie dies in February of 1850 at the age of 3. Son Willie dies in February of 1862. His losses are winter losses. Even as night came to the old soldier's home and the birds slowly quieted and the rustling of leaves settled, still the voices of his guards, Company K, could be heard just down the hill. How quiet were his late night thoughts, his times before dawn. He's reported to have said, "Did you ever dream of some lost friend and feel that you were having a sweet communion with him, and yet have a consciousness that it was not reality?" He was speaking of Willie, but we could be speaking of him. Dreams are at the heart of home, past, present, and future. Gaston Bachelard in The Poetics of Space writes, "The places in which we have experienced daydreaming reconstitute themselves in a new daydream. And it is because our memories of former dwelling places are relived as daydreams that those dwelling places of the past remain in us for all time. The log cabin is in this house. The White House in Springfield and the rooming house in New Salem are as well. Imagine him looking out of this room on a day like today, just like today, a day that has repeated itself for these last 150 years. The long shadows after sunrise, the awakening day. He feels the cool morning air. He sees Washington City to the south, bursting at the seams, teeming with new arrivals, while war rages farther away. But then it comes close. Cannon sounding. Lincoln goes to Fort Stevens, so close to here, to watch Confederate General Jubal Early's troops approaching, attempting to reach him and possibly to end the war. Bullets are in the air all around him. He doesn't seem to be afraid. On any morning, we can see him put one boot in the stirrup, push himself up and over the saddle, easing down as the leather complains just a bit, and in that same motion, setting the other black leather boot into its stirrup, testing the reins lightly, and pausing before applying a little pressure and turning the horse. This is the choreography of a veteran horseman. His eyes narrow a bit as he scans his surroundings, vigilant. Growing up on the frontier, the ones who survive are vigilant. Every detail is suspended around him, even the fly that alights on the mane of his horse. It seems like the same fly on a different twitching mane, thousands of times. On the way, he can see the Capitol dome off in the distance, encased in scaffolding, just like today. Time dissolves. Walt Whitman observed the man on his unimpressive horse, or in his very worn ordinary carriage, passing at Vermont and L Streets on many days, surrounded by cavalry with drawn swords. It was an escort he did not want. Whitman reports the look in his eyes, the sadness, but also the connection as they nodded to each other, familiar at a distance. There is some reckoning, some kinship in these brief moments. As an architect, I want to wonder how he experienced this house, this style, the materials, and its aesthetics. Was it beautiful to him in a conscious way? There may be a hint in how he addressed his own experience from Brownstein. After 20 years of marriage, and by then living at the nation's most distinguished address, Mary still had not given up trying to make her husband look like somebody. He merely submitting to occasional new clothes with more docility, including gloves on state occasions. He would sometimes even bend down to her so that she could smooth his coarse black hair. Perhaps it just wasn't in his nature to be concerned with such things. Not hair, not clothes, not Gothic revival. As a child of the frontier, he was more about setting, more about the life around him, less about things, bricks or mortar, or curves cut in wood. But we also know from the sensibilities and style of his writing that this was an exquisitely observant, and thoughtful man, that he could not have been immune to beauty. I agree with another wartime leader, Winston Churchill, that consciously or not, we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. How we move through space, what we see, what we are prevented from seeing, what comforts us, what energizes us. Architecture is an engine for experience. If I had designed this house for Lincoln's, I would have been designing a home for a family that had suffered loss, needed succor, and ongoing rejuvenation from the press of war. How do you do your job as an architect for this father, this mother, and for Tad, a young, exuberant, mischievous boy whose goat would tear up those stairs, hop into his bed, and put his head down on the pillow? How do you design for a woman dressed in black, or a man constantly facing a monumental existential challenge? I would pause and imagine. One example, I would imagine creating a lush enclosed garden in the middle of the house, benches and water so that they could be in and look in, embraced by the house, not only outward at the grounds in the city beyond. Imagine Lincoln reading, alone or to the family. Another, I would imagine balconies off the bedrooms, plural, that Mary and her husband occupied, oriented away from the city. Each of them could experience the beauty of the night, and they could meet each other where those balconies joined. Of course, there would be a garret play space for Tad where Lincoln would join him, but it would also be Tad's room of dreams and imagination. I would keep the house raised a half level from the grounds as it is now, and perhaps even a little higher to enhance both refuge and prospect. In other words, I would not have begun my thinking with a box, a container for all the rooms. I would have thought about how it would feel to be in each part of the house, how each space would be more open or more closed to the world around them. I would think about spaces to help them heal and restore individually, with them together, and with friends. And I would have worked to accomplish this without much architectural drama. I'm a traitor to my profession. It would be softer, quieter, not fortress-like, but it would nonetheless speak, saying that this was the president's house and not accessible to others at any time of their choosing. The house would allow the Lincolns to reach out or to stay in. Once here, we know that Mr. Lincoln drew distraction as well as comfort from the presence of the soldiers, both those wounded and those who were garrisoned here to protect him. The members of Company K became Tad's playmates and an important part of Lincoln's life. He would eat with them sometimes, particularly when Mary was away. He would share his wonderful stories and hear theirs. It nourished his soul's appetite for connection. Consider this house a vessel for the Lincolns. Vessel has two meanings: to contain, perhaps to protect on the one hand, and to provide passage. We might think of this house first as their home and second as their vessel to move with less pain and more joy through time. This place, with all the chips thrown in, gave the Lincolns at least a measure of what they needed. Mary wrote that it did, in spite of her anguish over Willie, and maybe because that anguish needed to be soaked up. Perhaps only nature and a remove from Washington City could do it. We know that Lincoln's great ideas grew here. The Emancipation Proclamation grew here, in this mini cauldron of the war, in this room. Slaves had been here in Riggs' time. Former slaves were here throughout the war, and his struggles with their struggles emerged slowly, becoming the proclamation, feet from where you sit now. Abraham Lincoln slept and dreamt here in this place, not for occasional weekends or for a few months, but for a full quarter of his extraordinary presidency. This was not his refuge or his escape. It was his vessel. It was and it remains at a remove, and we can all hope that it was enough for this family, for this man, for the 16th president of a nation that has endured. Thank you.
All right, well, with the awareness that we've run a little bit longer than anticipated, although perhaps not surprisingly, we'll spend maybe just 10 minutes or maybe a little bit longer if the momentum is carrying us to hear your ideas. Now, I was really glad that Milton Shinberg, in his very lyrical remarks, evoked that banister that runs down the stairway here, where you walk down and you know that Lincoln was holding that very piece of wood. And whenever I bring students here, that's really the thing that blows their mind the most. And I hope that today the remarks of some of these speakers, certainly for me, have made some of the ideas associated with Lincoln as tangible and palpable as that piece of the architecture of this house, and maybe also something that we can hold on to and that steadies us and guides us a little bit. So asking those of you who do speak to keep your remarks relatively concise. Would love to hear your thoughts and reflections on some of what you've heard. Yes, ma'am. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves, that would be great.
I'm Loretta Newman. I'm the president of a nonprofit organization, the Alliance for the Civil War Defenses of Washington, which were the fortifications that were built to protect the nation's capital during the Civil War. One of which is Fort Stevens, which is just a few miles northwest of here. And Abraham Lincoln did go out to Fort Stevens during the Battle of Fort Stevens, which was 150 years ago, what will be 151 years this summer. And it was the only Civil War battle in D.C. And it was also the only time a sitting president has ever been shot at under battle. So it's very significant, and I always think how I don't know if he was courageous, but Lincoln did stand up on that parapet, and he was shot at, and the man next to him was actually shot, a doctor. So, but that's one point I want to make, only to lead up to another, and that's what Mr. Schinberg said. I thought so beautifully at the beginning of your talk about it wasn't that long ago. And so when I get talks about the Battle of Fort Stevens, I always stress the fact that, 150 years is really, if people lived only 75-year lives, and these days, people live to be 100, very many do, that's only 2 lifespans. My husband here, Daniel Smith, is African American, and he is, in fact, the son of a baby slave. His father was born in 1862. He was born in 1932. The numbers work. His siblings and him are probably among the few left in the United States who can be that close. So they're even closer than you were, Mr. Schinberg. But as was pointed out by Mr. Miles and the other speakers, the issues are still there today, and it's from the human trafficking, but also the treatment of African Americans, as we've seen, and most recently in South Carolina, but also in Ferguson, and the issues of mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow, as was written about in the book by Michelle Alexander. All of those are current issues and ideas that we need to remember, and it is so important that we do understand history, and history teaches us to remember and appreciate what everybody had to say.
Well, and thank you, Loretta, for those comments. And wow, it gives me a chill to know that we're here in a room with a child of someone who was in slavery. It's remarkable and something I won't forget. So who would like to speak next?
John Elliff with the Lincoln Group of DC. Again, it's Mr. Schinberg's imagery. I'm thinking of 150 years ago today. Yesterday, Abraham Lincoln came back from over 2 weeks at City Point, down with General Grant. For most of that time, he had Mary and Tad with him. He visited the soldiers. He visited with the generals. He went to look at a beautiful site that overlooks the Appomattox and James Rivers coming together. And before he went, he had been seen by his friends, his colleagues, as drawn. He was ill. The war was really, the winter was really getting him down. General Grant invited him down to City Point. Did Mrs. Grant suggest it? Did Robert Todd Lincoln on the staff? Whatever. When he came back from that 2 weeks plus away from Washington, his friends saw him as invigorated, as prepared now to take on the challenges of reunion after Appomattox. And I like to remember what was happening in the space, in the moving away from Washington, in the finding that invigoration that brought him back to Washington. And I'm a believer in thinking about alternative history and what would have happened with this invigorated president and leading the country to reunion. Oh, I should also add, the Lincoln Group of DC is taking a trip down to City Point in June, and go to lincolngroup.org to find out if you'd like to go.
And thank you for bringing that up, because it is one of the great questions of history. And I'm with you. A lot of historians don't like to talk about counterfactuals, but I think it's so important. And one of the great questions is these ideas that had carried Lincoln, as we said, through the 4 years of the Civil War, what would have happened to them? Where would they have taken him if they'd moved past that inflection point of the end of the war? So who would like to speak next? And not every comment has to be just composed. And I mean, we've had 2 very eloquent speakers so far, but just questions that may have come up, unfinished thoughts, things we may not have talked about. Yes.
A brief comment, not really related to Lincoln, but during the talk about security and the attack on Blair House. Any of you that might be interested, there's a very interesting book called American Gunfight about that time. And I read the book, and I found it fascinating.
About that attack.
About that attack.
Yeah. And of course, Lincoln was back and forth to Blair House himself all the time during his presidency. Any other comments?
I'd just like to ask the Secret Service gentleman, what's going on with Secret Service?
I should mention that. I should mention Mr. Dixon said when he came here that he's not supposed to take questions, and I guess unless you care to, but he's.
No official comments.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about that balance between security and liberty, both liberty for the people who interact with the president and liberty for the person who happens to be the president. It's such an issue in our own times that touches not just on safety, but also on bigger ideas in the world about national security versus national freedom, and I'm curious about whether Mr. Dixon's interesting remarks raised some of those questions for people here. Yes?
Actually, what suggested to me was that the commentators may have something to, or speakers may have something to say to each other, because what was so interesting is that all of them touched on fear, security, and freedom from fear, freedom from threat. But in very different ways. And I don't know if that was part of the call, if that was one of the things you were supposed to be talking about, or if that was something that came to you because of the nature of the talks here today. And also what you heard from each other that sparked reflections on those issues.
It wasn't part of the call, but I think it's really interesting that you pick out this common thread. And I saw some other hands going up over here. So.
This is a silly question, but wasn't it during, was it January 1st of each year that people could go to the White House? And I mean, right. How ironic. I mean, isn't that what Lincoln himself did?
Yeah, and that was something that continued, I think, up into the 20th century, actually. It may have been TR. Do you know if it was TR? I'm sorry? As far as I know, what they used to do was they would actually take the windows of the White House and they would remove the sash and turn them into doors and put sort of temporary wooden stairs that went up, and so people would use those windows as doors and just go in, and they actually would trash the White House on some occasions, and they would take their pocket knives out and they would cut pieces off the curtains as souvenirs, and they would climb up on the furniture to get a better view of the president. And it was sort of a nightmare. It really was. Okay, other comments? Yeah.
I'm Frank Lawrence. I'm a resident here at the what's this retirement home. Nothing's changed. You can go down to D.C. today and have a whole day down here and get back here. Thank God for the rest.
That's great to know. And do you feel when you're here a sense of kinship and connection to the men who were here during and after the Civil War who participated?
I think so, yes.
You do. And you're a veteran of a war yourself?
That's stretching the point a bit. I was involved in Korean and Vietnam wars, but I didn't have feet on the ground.
Okay. Other comments? I'm curious, about that relationship. We talked, or I mentioned a little bit in my opening remarks about the Civil War as a war of ideas. There are so many wars that are wars over territory or wars over retaliation on attacks, responses to threats, and the Civil War wasn't necessarily those things. And so I'm curious if people have thoughts about the 1860s as a moment of ideas, why there are so many ideas that we still think about today that come issuing out of that time, out of that moment in American history. I wonder if people have thoughts. Yes, sir. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself as well, that'd be great.
I'm Gordon Berg, past president of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia, and I grew up within walking distance of here. So the defenses of Washington and the Soldiers' Home are sort of childhood memories. The question, I think, is that the 1860s in Europe and all across the world was a time of ferment. From the 1840s, the revolutions, into the unification of Italy in the 1860s. So I think that the whole idea of republicanism and democracy and things like that were sort of in the air. And so I think that there are several books been written about putting the Civil War in context of a global situation. And I think Lincoln actually, you referenced it, realized that this wasn't just a war about either keeping this nation unified or abolishing slavery. This was an event that would be looked at by the entire world to see if a representative democracy could in fact function in the second half of the 20th century. And had Lincoln not been successful in keeping the Union together, I think if you're looking at counterfactual history, the evolution of democratic principles throughout the rest of the 19th and early 20th century might have suffered a severe setback.
Thank you.
Realistically, the South was in an economic turmoil. It was not ideas for the South so much as would they lose their whole economy. And there was so much vested interest and wealth that was involved in the retention of slaves that they simply could not see themselves as giving that up. So for Lincoln, it may have been an idea issue, but I think that for the South, it was truly an economic crisis.
Yeah, I think we can see economics and ideas intertwined as so often in American history, in the American Revolution, in other moments. And it is always worth remembering. I always, at Washington College, take my students down to the courthouse, and we pull out the old ledger books with the estates and inventories and sales. We talk about, well, what happens when people become property, all kinds of terrible things when you put those dollar values next to human beings, and especially when it gets to the point where the value of the slaves in America added up to more than the total of the value of all the factories and railroads in America, more than the value of all the real estate in the South. Awful, awful things can happen, absolutely. Yes, sir.
Curtis Harris. Currently at FOSO Foundation, formerly from Lincoln's College. About the ideas of the war. Yesterday being the surrender at Appomattox, being the anniversary of the Confederacy, I guess you can call it the official demise of the military and the government. But I think the battle and war of ideas continued well after that. I mean, even still continues today. Because you look at the statements that the seceded states made when they left the Union. My home state, Texas, they said that the subordination of Africans to Europeans was like a relationship they intended to exist for all future time. So just because the military was defeated didn't mean that the idea they had was defeated. So what I take away is that this battle of ideas, the military battle of these ideas was finished, but then the ideological battle still had to take place for years and years afterwards. So that's why you got situations like 100 years later, Martin Luther King at the Lincoln Memorial invoking the Emancipation Proclamation to buttress his ideas on what liberty should mean in the United States. And of course, still today, South Carolina, that situation was mentioned. Like that was outside of Charleston. Just like the same week that the war ended, or the anniversary of the war ended, you have like the hotbed of secession. That city's history involved with that. So you can see how just these ideas still need to be thought out, still need to be discussed, still need to be sussed out in our country. Because as much as we would like to think that we settled the issue of slavery, which was mentioned, that issue wasn't settled because the ideology that perpetuated slavery at that time period still perpetuates it today. So we still have work to do on solving that issue and solving all these ideas.
I think that was one of Lincoln's own great ideas. There was a moment early in his presidency when, on his way to Washington a couple weeks before his inauguration, he stopped at Independence Hall and spoke about the Declaration of Independence. And he actually said that document wasn't merely a political statement, it was a charter for continuing progress. And that's what I'm fighting to defend. And rather than giving that up, he said, and this was really chilling, he said, rather than giving that up, I would rather be assassinated on this spot. And I wonder, we probably have time for maybe one or two more comments, or one more comment. Okay, and I wonder if anybody wants to talk about maybe ideas of Lincoln's that have special relevance today or that we should be particularly focusing on, maybe that haven't been getting the attention that they deserve. Yes, sir.
My name is Vin Roque, and I was taken by the comment about Lincoln's pro-immigration philosophy. Didn't get him any Irish Catholic votes. I don't know, because maybe his opposition to slavery trumped for them his being a proponent of immigration. But I was very struck with the fact that, as good a politician as he was, he didn't spend his entire political career pandering to voting blocs. That he actually took 7 or 8 weeks to sit down and to write out, if you will, a philosophy of where the country was, what needed to be done, what his views were on what needed to be done. So it's he's very profoundly remembered.
Thank you. And maybe, I'm sorry, yeah.
Something very quick. I want to express my personal thanks to the soldiers home overall and to the Lincoln Cottage staff, especially Aaron and Callie. The opportunity for a non-scholar to swim in the Lincoln River for a bit with me is something that I not just enjoyed, but has had a fun and me, so thank you.
It's clearly a big enough river for all of us. I'm glad that we're leaving with ideas still percolating, and I hope maybe our speakers, at least some of them, can hang around for a few minutes if any of you have individual comments and questions. Thanks so much to all of you for coming into the cottage.